Sometimes the most expensive mistake a billionaire can make is believing the person he left behind stayed exactly where he abandoned her. Ethan Walker barely looked up from the crystal wine glass in his hand as the pianist drifted into another soft rendition of an old Frank Sinatra classic. Friday evenings at the Grand Lexington were predictable. Venture capitalists closed deals over dry-aged steaks. Politicians smiled for cameras they pretended not to notice. CEOs measured success by the vintage of their wine and the names that greeted them at neighboring tables. Ethan belonged here. At least, that was what he believed. 3 years after divorcing Claire Anderson, his technology company had become one of Chicago's fastest-growing firms, and tonight was supposed to celebrate another milestone. Across from him, his fiancée, Vanessa Collins, laughed while scrolling through photos of a luxury wedding venue in Napa Valley. Everything about the evening reflected the life Ethan had chosen. Expensive lighting shimmered against polished marble floors. Waiters glided silently between tables carrying silver trays. Conversations blended into a quiet rhythm of confidence and wealth. Then the restaurant door opened. Ethan noticed her without meaning to. She wasn't dressed like anyone else in the room. Claire wore a simple cream-colored maternity dress beneath a light camel coat despite the cool spring evening. Comfortable flats replaced designer heels. Her long chestnut hair rested naturally over one shoulder, and one hand gently supported the unmistakable curve of her pregnancy. She looked calm. Too calm. Ethan stared longer than he intended. For a brief second, the elegant restaurant around him disappeared beneath memories he had spent years convincing himself no longer mattered. Claire had once waited for him after work with homemade dinners that usually grew cold before he arrived. She had celebrated every promotion as though it belonged to both of them. She believed in him before investors ever returned his calls. Then success came. Bigger offices. Larger contracts. New circles of influential people. Somewhere along the way Ethan convinced himself Claire no longer fit the future he imagined. The divorce had been surprisingly simple. Lawyers handled the paperwork. Friends quietly chose sides. Ethan walked away believing ambition demanded sacrifice. Claire simply disappeared. He had never bothered finding out where. Vanessa noticed his silence. "Do you know her?" she asked, following his gaze across the dining room. Ethan leaned back with practiced confidence. "My ex-wife." Vanessa raised an eyebrow before looking Claire over from head to toe. "She's pregnant." Ethan nodded slowly. "Looks like life moved on for both of us." His words sounded casual, but something unsettled him. Claire didn't look defeated. She wasn't scanning the room awkwardly or trying to avoid attention. Instead, she checked the time on her watch before quietly taking a seat near the panoramic windows overlooking the Chicago River. She wasn't eating. She wasn't meeting family. She wasn't even looking at the menu. She was waiting. Ethan smirked. "Probably meeting someone." Vanessa smiled politely. "Hopefully whoever he is treats her well." Ethan shrugged, although he couldn't explain the strange weight settling somewhere beneath his confidence. He expected bitterness. He expected regret. He expected to see traces of the woman who cried when she signed the divorce papers. Instead, he found someone whose expression carried remarkable peace. The waiter approached Claire with obvious familiarity. Ethan watched him speak respectfully before placing only a glass of sparkling water on the table. No order. No rush. Almost as though the staff had been expecting her arrival for hours. The piano music softened. Outside, city lights reflected across the river like ribbons of liquid gold. Then everything changed. The front entrance opened once more. 6 men and 3 women entered together wearing tailored business suits. They weren't merely wealthy. Their posture revealed something else entirely. Decision-makers. Executives. People accustomed to walking into boardrooms where fortunes shifted with a single signature. Ethan recognized several faces immediately. One was the CEO of a Fortune 500 logistics company. Another chaired one of the largest commercial banks in the Midwest. A third regularly appeared on the cover of Forbes. None of them looked toward the hostess. None waited to be seated. Instead, every one of them walked directly across the restaurant toward Claire. Conversations around the dining room gradually faded. Silverware paused halfway to plates. Even nearby servers slowed instinctively as the group stopped beside Claire's table. The oldest executive smiled warmly. "Good evening, boss," he said with genuine respect. "We're ready whenever you are." 8 others echoed quiet greetings almost simultaneously. "Good evening, boss." "Good to see you, boss." "The team has everything prepared." The single word landed harder than any shout could have. "Boss." Ethan felt his fingers loosen around his wine glass. Vanessa looked from Claire to the executives, then back to Ethan, confusion spreading across her face. Claire stood gracefully, offering each executive a calm handshake before thanking them for waiting. Her voice remained soft, measured, completely at ease. There was no surprise in her expression because she had expected every one of them. Ethan's heartbeat quickened as another familiar face hurried through the entrance carrying a leather portfolio. Daniel Brooks, the respected chief operating officer of Anderson Capital, stopped beside Claire with an apologetic smile. "Sorry I'm 2 minutes late, boss," he said. "The acquisition documents are ready. The board is waiting upstairs." Claire accepted the portfolio without the slightest hesitation. "Perfect," she replied. "Let's begin." As the group disappeared toward the private executive elevators, nearly everyone in the restaurant watched them leave. Ethan remained frozen in his chair. Only one thought echoed louder than the pianist, louder than the quiet conversations slowly returning around him, louder than his own pulse. Since when had Claire Anderson become someone powerful enough that America's top executives called her boss? The private executive elevator doors closed behind Claire, and the quiet hum of the mechanism carried her toward the top floor while the voices inside the restaurant slowly returned to normal. Ethan could not hear what was happening upstairs, but every unanswered question seemed louder than the conversations around him. Vanessa leaned forward carefully. "Ethan, who exactly was your ex-wife?" He forced a laugh that sounded far less convincing than he intended. "She was just Claire. We were married for 6 years. Vanessa studied his expression instead of accepting the answer. "People like that do not call someone boss unless they have a very good reason." Ethan looked toward the closed elevator doors one more time before reaching for his water. His hand stopped halfway. For the first time in years, certainty abandoned him. 3 years earlier, certainty had guided every decision he made. Back then, Ethan believed success always required choosing logic over emotion. Claire had never argued when he stayed late at the office. She never complained when weekends disappeared beneath investor meetings and business trips. She celebrated every small victory, as though the company belonged to both of them. During the difficult years before anyone knew Ethan Walker's name, Claire quietly carried responsibilities that allowed him to chase impossible dreams. She managed household bills, encouraged him after failed presentations, and reminded him that temporary setbacks did not define permanent futures. She was the person who believed in him before anyone else did. When the company finally began attracting serious investment, everything changed much faster than either of them expected. Ethan suddenly found himself surrounded by venture capital executives, financial advisors, and influential entrepreneurs. Every conference introduced someone wealthier. Every networking dinner created another opportunity. Success became addictive. Recognition became expected. Somewhere inside that new world, Claire started looking ordinary. She still preferred neighborhood coffee shops instead of exclusive clubs. She still drove the same modest sedan long after Ethan upgraded to a luxury vehicle. She spoke more about family than quarterly growth. Ethan convinced himself those differences meant they had grown apart, but looking back years later, the truth was far less complicated. He had simply stopped appreciating the person who stood beside him before anyone else believed he mattered. One evening, after another fundraising celebration, Ethan returned home carrying expensive champagne and exciting news about another major investment. Claire had prepared dinner, but he barely noticed the candles waiting on the dining table. She smiled and congratulated him before quietly sharing news of her own. She was expecting their first child. Ethan remembered freezing for several seconds before forcing a smile. Friends later described that moment as the beginning of a beautiful new chapter. Only Ethan knew what he actually felt. Fear. Responsibility. Timing that seemed inconvenient. He buried those emotions beneath work until distance slowly replaced conversation. Months passed with fewer dinners together and more nights spent inside conference rooms. Claire tried to convince herself the pressure would ease once the company stabilized. Instead, Ethan became increasingly convinced that family obligations would only slow the future he imagined. Their conversations turned shorter. Their silence became longer. Eventually, lawyers entered the picture before counselors ever had the chance. The divorce itself unfolded with remarkable efficiency. Assets were divided. Documents were signed. Neither of them created public drama. Friends admired how mature both parties appeared. No one noticed Claire quietly placing her wedding ring into a small velvet box before walking away without asking for sympathy. She accepted the settlement exactly as written. She requested nothing beyond privacy. Ethan interpreted her silence as surrender. After the divorce became official, Claire disappeared from every social circle they once shared. She deleted social media accounts, changed her phone number, declined invitations. Within months, people simply stopped mentioning her name. Ethan never searched for answers because he assumed there were none worth finding. In his mind, Claire became another chapter already completed. He built a larger company, purchased a penthouse overlooking Lake Michigan, appeared on business magazines, began dating Vanessa, whose career moved comfortably alongside his expanding reputation. Looking back, the story seemed simple. He had moved forward. Claire had faded into the background. At least, that was the version Ethan repeated often enough that he eventually believed it himself. Yet sitting inside the Grand Lexington tonight, every comfortable assumption cracked apart. The executives who followed Claire upstairs were not pretending. Daniel Brooks was certainly not pretending. Ethan knew Anderson Capital by reputation. Every entrepreneur in America did. The investment firm rarely appeared in headlines, but when it acquired companies, entire industries shifted. It specialized in identifying undervalued businesses years before competitors recognized their potential. Financial magazines called its leadership mysterious because almost no public interviews existed. Even experienced investors rarely identified the person making final decisions. Ethan had always imagined someone decades older. Someone born into generational wealth. Someone who had spent an entire lifetime building influence. The possibility that Claire somehow belonged at the center of that organization had never crossed his mind. Vanessa quietly broke the silence. "Do you think she inherited something?" Ethan opened his mouth before realizing he had no answer. Then another memory surfaced unexpectedly. During their marriage, Claire occasionally disappeared for a few hours each month, always explaining she had family matters to handle. Ethan never asked questions because he assumed they were ordinary obligations. She never discussed relatives in detail. She never talked about money. She never displayed luxury. She lived so naturally that he had never once wondered what parts of her life existed beyond the version she chose to share. For the first time since their divorce, Ethan began asking himself a question that refused to leave. How much had he truly known about the woman he once believed was completely ordinary? The questions followed Ethan long after the elevator doors disappeared from view. They echoed beneath the soft piano music, hid inside the quiet conversations around neighboring tables, and settled into every uneasy silence between him and Vanessa. He had spent years believing success came from seeing people clearly, yet tonight he realized there was one person he had never truly understood. Upstairs, beyond doors reserved for private executive meetings, Claire was apparently leading a room filled with some of the most respected business leaders in the country. Downstairs, Ethan remained trapped inside memories that suddenly refused to match reality. He glanced toward the maitre d' stand where guests continued arriving for dinner. Everyone behaved as though nothing extraordinary had happened. Yet several diners quietly whispered while pretending to study their menus. They had witnessed the same moment. 9 accomplished executives had entered one of Chicago's most exclusive restaurants and greeted an apparently ordinary pregnant woman with genuine respect. It was not staged. It was not accidental. It was recognition. Vanessa slowly placed her phone on the table. "I looked up Anderson Capital," she said softly. "Their website still does not list an executive chairman. It only mentions a leadership committee." Ethan frowned. "That is impossible. Every company has someone making the final decision." Vanessa turned the screen toward him. "Apparently this one prefers not to advertise who that person is." Ethan stared at the company profile. The numbers alone were staggering. Billions of dollars in managed assets. Investments across technology, healthcare, logistics, renewable energy, and commercial real estate. Quiet acquisitions that had transformed struggling companies into industry leaders. Financial journalists often described Anderson Capital as the invisible hand behind some of America's largest corporate success stories. Ethan had read those articles before, but never with personal interest. Now every sentence seemed to carry new meaning. A memory surfaced unexpectedly. During one difficult year before his first breakthrough, an investor meeting had collapsed only hours before contracts were supposed to be signed. Ethan remembered pacing across his small office in frustration, convinced the company would fail before reaching profitability. The next morning, another investment group unexpectedly stepped forward. With better terms. His attorney had called it an extraordinary coincidence. Ethan accepted the explanation without asking further questions because success arrived exactly when he needed it. Tonight he wondered whether coincidence had ever been the real answer. "You are quiet," Vanessa observed. Ethan forced himself back to the present. "I am trying to understand how someone can disappear for 3 years and suddenly become..." He stopped before finishing the sentence because no description felt adequate. Powerful seemed too small. Influential seemed incomplete. Mysterious came closest, yet even that failed to explain the respect he had just witnessed. The waiter arrived carrying fresh coffee. "Compliments of the house," he said politely. Ethan looked up. "We did not order coffee." The waiter smiled professionally. "Management wanted to thank you for your patience this evening, sir. The executive conference upstairs required additional coordination." Ethan watched the waiter leave before asking quietly, "Does something important happen here tonight?" Vanessa answered before anyone else could. "Apparently." Across the dining room, another familiar figure entered carrying several document cases. Ethan recognized him immediately. Michael Reeves, one of the country's most respected corporate attorneys. His firm represented Fortune 100 companies and mergers worth billions of dollars. Michael greeted the restaurant manager briefly before taking the private elevator upstairs without hesitation. Barely 2 minutes later, another executive arrived. Then another. Each one disappeared toward the same meeting. Ethan counted nearly 20 influential business leaders entering the building within half an hour. It no longer resembled a dinner reservation. It looked like history unfolding behind closed doors. Ethan reached for his phone and opened his calendar. Tomorrow morning his own board would finalize negotiations for a strategic partnership expected to double company revenue within 2 years. He suddenly noticed the investment firm representing the other side. Brookstone Equity Partners. Ethan frowned. Something about the name seemed familiar. He searched through recent financial news. An article appeared from only 2 weeks earlier. Brookstone had recently entered exclusive negotiations with Anderson Capital regarding a nationwide acquisition initiative. Ethan read the headline twice before lowering the phone. His pulse accelerated. If Anderson Capital controlled those negotiations, then Claire's meeting tonight might have consequences extending far beyond the restaurant. It could affect industries, markets, entire corporations, perhaps even his own. Vanessa watched his expression carefully. "What is wrong?" Ethan hesitated before answering. "I think whatever is happening upstairs is much bigger than I realized." At that exact moment, the private elevator doors opened again. Several executives stepped out, speaking quietly while reviewing folders filled with legal documents. They looked satisfied. Optimistic. Daniel Brooks remained inside, apparently continuing the meeting. One executive paused near the entrance while answering a phone call. Ethan overheard only a single sentence before the man disappeared into the night. Tell the board the boss approved everything. We move forward first thing Monday morning. Ethan sat perfectly still. Approved everything. Those two words carried extraordinary weight. Someone upstairs had just authorized decisions worth hundreds of millions of dollars, perhaps more. And every piece of evidence pointed toward the same impossible conclusion. Claire was no longer connected to powerful people. She was the person making the final decisions. Ethan slowly leaned back in his chair, replaying every conversation they had shared during 6 years of marriage. Claire had never boasted. Never corrected anyone's assumptions. Never hinted that she possessed unusual influence. She listened more than she spoke. She encouraged others without asking for recognition. He had mistaken humility for simplicity. He had confused quiet confidence with ordinary living. Now, for the first time since signing the divorce papers, Ethan began to wonder whether the greatest opportunity he had ever lost was never his company, his investments, or any business deal at all. It was the woman whose true identity he had never cared enough to discover until someone else called her boss. Monday morning arrived beneath a gray Chicago sky, but Ethan Walker barely noticed the weather. His thoughts had remained trapped inside the Grand Lexington since the previous evening. Every time he closed his eyes, he heard the same word repeated with effortless respect. Boss. By 8 o'clock he was already inside the glass headquarters of Walker Technologies overlooking the river, standing in front of floor-to-ceiling windows while the city slowly came alive below. Normally mornings like this filled him with confidence. Today they only raised more questions. Olivia Carter, his executive assistant, stepped quietly into the office carrying a tablet. Your board meeting begins in 30 minutes, she said. Brookstone Equity confirmed attendance. Their legal team is already here. Ethan nodded absent-mindedly before asking the question that had occupied his mind since sunrise. Olivia, what do you know about Anderson Capital? She looked mildly surprised. Only what everyone in finance knows. They almost never lose money. Their acquisitions usually become case studies at business schools. Why? Ethan hesitated. Who actually runs the company? Olivia shook her head. Nobody seems completely sure. People speculate every year, but leadership stays remarkably private. Before Ethan could respond, his office phone rang. The caller identification displayed the name of his chief financial officer, Mark Reynolds. Ethan answered immediately. Tell me we are ready for today. There was a brief pause before Mark replied. Mostly. There is one unexpected development. Ethan felt his stomach tighten. Go on. Brookstone postponed the final signing until this afternoon. Ethan frowned. Why would they delay after 6 months of negotiations? They received instructions late last night from another stakeholder. Ethan slowly lowered himself into his chair. Which stakeholder? Mark answered carefully. Anderson Capital. Silence filled the office. Ethan glanced toward Olivia, who immediately recognized from his expression that something important had changed. Did they explain the reason? Ethan finally asked. No, Mark replied. Only that someone wanted additional financial reviews before giving final approval. Giving final approval. The same words he had overheard inside the restaurant returned with unsettling clarity. Ethan ended the call without another question. Olivia waited politely before speaking. Should I contact Brookstone? Ethan shook his head. Not yet. She quietly left the office, leaving him alone with thoughts that no longer fit together. He opened his laptop and reviewed every available report concerning Anderson Capital. The deeper he searched, the stranger the pattern became. The company rarely appeared in interviews. Major executives almost never accepted awards publicly. Press releases emphasized teamwork rather than individual leadership. Even photographs from shareholder meetings carefully avoided identifying whoever occupied the highest position. It was as though someone had intentionally erased one name from every public record. Ethan leaned back and rubbed his temples. 3 years earlier he had believed Claire wanted a peaceful, uncomplicated life. She disliked unnecessary attention. She rarely posted photographs online. During their marriage she once told him that real influence did not require public recognition. At the time he dismissed the comment as idealistic. Now it sounded almost prophetic. Another memory surfaced. One rainy afternoon years earlier, Ethan had walked into their apartment carrying several investor rejection letters. He remembered throwing the folders onto the kitchen counter in frustration. Claire quietly brewed fresh coffee before placing a handwritten note beside his cup. It contained only one sentence. "The people who make the biggest difference are usually the last ones anyone notices." Ethan smiled politely back then without understanding why she believed that. Today the memory carried entirely different weight. His phone vibrated again. This time the message came directly from Brookstone's lead negotiator. "Looking forward to this afternoon. Final approval expected after Anderson Capital concludes internal review." Ethan stared at the words for several seconds. Internal review? Approval? Decision? Every road somehow led back to the same company. At 11 o'clock the board meeting finally began. Directors discussed forecasts, expansion strategies, and projected earnings, yet Ethan found it increasingly difficult to focus. Halfway through the presentation, one independent board member interrupted with unexpected news. "I heard Anderson Capital may be entering the artificial intelligence sector more aggressively this year." Another director nodded. "If that rumor is true, entire valuations could change overnight." Mark looked toward Ethan. "Fortunately, they have never shown interest in acquiring companies like ours." Before Ethan could answer, Olivia quietly entered the conference room carrying a sealed envelope. "This was delivered by courier," she said. "Marked confidential." Ethan accepted the envelope and noticed there was no company logo on the outside. Only his full name printed in elegant lettering. Every director watched as he carefully opened it. Inside rested a single cream-colored invitation embossed with understated silver lettering. Anderson Capital Executive Conference. Private Board Reception. 7 o'clock this evening. The Grand Lexington. Formal business attire required. At the bottom appeared one handwritten sentence. "We look forward to continuing yesterday's conversation." Ethan read it twice. Then a third time. Yesterday's conversation. He had never spoken to anyone from Anderson Capital. Unless watching Claire across a crowded restaurant somehow counted as the beginning of a conversation neither of them had expected. One by one, the board members leaned closer, trying to read the invitation themselves. Mark finally broke the silence. "Ethan, why would Anderson Capital invite you personally?" Ethan folded the invitation carefully before placing it back inside the envelope. For the first time in years, he answered a business question with complete honesty. "I honestly do not know." Yet somewhere deep inside, another possibility had already begun taking shape. Perhaps tonight was never about a merger. Perhaps someone upstairs at the Grand Lexington had noticed him watching from across the dining room. And perhaps Claire Anderson had decided that after 3 years of silence, it was finally time for Ethan Walker to discover who she had always been. By 6:30 that evening, the Grand Lexington looked entirely different from the restaurant Ethan had visited the night before. The elegant dining room remained open to guests, but the upper executive level had transformed into one of the most tightly controlled business gatherings in Chicago. Luxury sedans lined the entrance beneath soft, golden lights while security professionals quietly verified invitations before allowing anyone inside. Every guest carried the calm confidence of someone accustomed to influencing billion-dollar decisions. Ethan adjusted his navy suit as he stepped from the elevator onto the private executive floor. The atmosphere was surprisingly quiet. There were no television cameras. No reporters. No promotional banners celebrating another corporate success. Everything reflected understated confidence instead of public attention. A receptionist greeted him with a warm smile. "Good evening, Mr. Walker. Welcome. They have been expecting you." The sentence unsettled him more than he expected. They. Whoever they were, They already knew he would accept the invitation. He followed the receptionist through a marble corridor lined with contemporary artwork before arriving outside a pair of walnut conference doors. Inside, conversations drifted softly beneath the gentle clink of coffee cups and crystal glasses. The receptionist opened the doors. "Please enjoy the reception. The board session will begin shortly." Ethan stepped inside and immediately recognized several influential figures from the previous evening. Chief executive officers, investment bankers, attorneys, and technology founders stood in small groups discussing markets with remarkable ease. Nearly everyone in the room controlled companies that shaped industries across the country. Yet despite the extraordinary concentration of wealth and influence, one detail stood out immediately. Every conversation seemed to pause for brief moments whenever someone glanced toward the far side of the room. Ethan followed their attention. Claire stood beside floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Chicago skyline. She wore a tailored ivory maternity suit that balanced professionalism with quiet elegance. Her appearance remained understated, yet every executive approaching her carried the same respectful expression Ethan had witnessed the previous night. Some requested advice. Others thanked her for previous guidance. A few simply exchanged brief updates before continuing through the room. None behaved as though they were speaking to a celebrity. They behaved as though they were speaking to the person whose judgment they trusted most. Ethan remained near the entrance, watching silently. Daniel Brooks noticed him first. The experienced executive crossed the room with a welcoming smile. "Mr. Walker," he said while extending his hand. "Thank you for coming." Ethan returned the handshake. "I appreciate the invitation, although I still do not completely understand why I am here." Daniel smiled politely. "You will." Before Ethan could ask another question, Daniel was called away by another guest. Ethan turned back toward Claire just as an older gentleman with silver hair approached her carrying a leather portfolio. Several executives immediately stepped aside, creating space without anyone requesting it. Ethan recognized the man from countless financial publications. William Anderson, founder of Anderson Capital, one of the most respected investors of his generation. Ethan had never met him personally, but nearly every entrepreneur in America knew his reputation. William greeted Claire with unmistakable warmth. "Good evening, Claire," he said. "Everything is ready whenever you are." Claire smiled naturally. "Thank you, Dad. I reviewed the final reports this afternoon. We can move forward exactly as planned." Ethan felt the room disappear around him. "Dad." The single word echoed through his thoughts with overwhelming clarity. William Anderson was Claire's father. The realization unlocked dozens of forgotten moments all at once. Claire had never spoken extensively about her family. Whenever Ethan asked about her parents, she simply smiled and changed the subject. He assumed they preferred private lives somewhere outside the city. He never pressed further because he believed their background had little relevance to his ambitions. Standing only a few yards away now, Ethan understood that his assumptions had never been challenged because Claire never wanted them to be. William rested a reassuring hand gently on his daughter's shoulder before looking toward the executives gathering nearby. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced with calm authority, "before tonight's meeting officially begins, I would like to recognize the person who has quietly led Anderson Capital through its most successful decade." Conversations faded instantly. Every guest turned toward Claire. William continued speaking with unmistakable pride. 15 years ago, Claire asked me for one opportunity. She wanted to learn every part of this business from the ground up without anyone knowing she was my daughter. She worked as an analyst, an associate, an investment manager, and eventually became the person making our final decisions. Most of our greatest investments over the past decade were hers. She earned every achievement through discipline rather than privilege. A quiet round of applause spread naturally across the room. It was respectful, genuine, and completely deserved. Ethan stood perfectly still, absorbing every word. 15 years. Claire had already been building one of the country's most influential investment careers long before she met him. Long before his first startup struggled to pay monthly rent. Long before he proudly explained business strategies to the woman he assumed knew very little about finance. Memory after memory returned with painful clarity. Claire suggesting patient growth instead of reckless expansion. Claire asking thoughtful questions about risk that he casually dismissed. Claire encouraging him to focus on sustainable leadership instead of rapid recognition. He had mistaken wisdom for simplicity because she never argued when he ignored her advice. William smiled toward his daughter once more. Many people assume leadership begins with speaking the loudest, he said. Claire proved that true leadership begins with listening longer than everyone else. The applause grew stronger. Ethan lowered his eyes, suddenly realizing the greatest irony of his career. He had spent years chasing the respect of powerful investors while quietly walking away from one of the most extraordinary business minds he would ever meet, simply because she never felt the need to announce who she truly was. The applause gradually faded, but the atmosphere inside the executive reception had changed forever for Ethan Walker. Only minutes earlier he had entered the room believing he was attending another routine corporate gathering. Now he stood surrounded by evidence that every assumption he had ever made about Claire had been painfully incomplete. Executives continued approaching her with reports, brief updates, and handwritten notes, requiring final approval. She listened carefully before answering each person with remarkable patience. She never raised her voice. She never tried to dominate the room. Yet every decision naturally flowed through her. Ethan finally understood why nobody questioned her authority. It had nothing to do with her family name. It came from years of earning trust one conversation at a time. Daniel Brooks returned carrying 2 cups of coffee. "Would you care to join me for a moment?" he asked politely. Ethan accepted without hesitation. They stepped toward a quieter corner overlooking the city lights. "I have to admit," Ethan began carefully, "I never knew any of this." Daniel smiled with quiet understanding. "Very few people did." Ethan looked back toward Claire. "She never told me." Daniel nodded. "That was intentional." Ethan waited for him to continue. "Claire believed that titles change the way people behave. She wanted relationships built on character instead of reputation. She always said that if someone only respected her because of her last name, then that respect never belonged to her in the first place." Ethan lowered his eyes. Those words sounded exactly like Claire. Quiet. Thoughtful. Honest. Daniel took another sip of coffee before adding, "Your name came up several times over the years." Ethan looked up immediately. "Mine?" "Whenever Walker Technologies appeared in one of our investment reviews." Ethan felt his pulse quicken. "What do you mean?" Daniel hesitated only. "Briefly. Claire always removed herself from the room whenever your company was discussed. She insisted every recommendation involving Walker Technologies should be evaluated independently by the rest of the investment committee." Ethan frowned. "Because we were divorced?" "Because she refused to allow personal history to influence professional judgment." Ethan remained silent. Daniel continued calmly. "Some members believed Anderson Capital should acquire a controlling interest in your company years ago. Others argued against it. Claire never voted either way. She believed that would be unfair to everyone involved." Ethan struggled to process what he was hearing. He had assumed Claire disappeared completely after the divorce. Instead, she had quietly protected the integrity of decisions that could have affected his entire career. Across the room, William Anderson welcomed several international investors while Claire reviewed financial documents with another executive. Her expression remained composed despite the constant stream of conversations demanding her attention. She looked neither overwhelmed nor distracted. She simply moved from one discussion to the next with steady confidence. Ethan noticed something else. Every few minutes someone asked whether she needed to sit down or take a break because of her pregnancy. Each time she smiled appreciatively before reassuring them that she felt perfectly fine. The concerns surrounding her carried warmth instead of obligation. These people genuinely cared about her well-being. Vanessa suddenly appeared beside Ethan. She had accepted an invitation from another guest after learning Ethan would remain for the reception. Her eyes moved immediately toward Claire. I have been listening to people talk, she said quietly. Do you know what everyone keeps saying? Ethan shook his head. Nobody mentions how wealthy she is. Nobody talks about her father. They all talk about how she helped them when their companies were struggling. Ethan glanced toward Daniel, who quietly confirmed the observation with a nod. Vanessa continued. One executive told me Claire spent 6 hours helping his management team during the financial crisis, even though there was no obligation to do so. Another said she personally called him after his wife became ill just to ask how his family was doing. They respect her because she remembers people. Ethan felt another memory return without warning. Years earlier, during the earliest days of his company, Claire kept a small notebook beside the kitchen counter. Whenever he mentioned an employee facing personal challenges, she quietly wrote down the person's name. Days later, she always asked how that employee was doing. Ethan used to smile at what he considered an unnecessary habit. Now he wondered how many successful leaders had benefited from that same instinct for genuine compassion. Before he could speak again, the lights inside the reception room dimmed slightly as a large presentation screen illuminated the far wall. William Anderson approached the podium. Ladies and gentlemen, he announced, thank you for joining us. Tonight marks the beginning of the most important expansion in our company's history. A detailed map of the United States appeared on the screen. New offices, investment regions, and technology partnerships gradually filled the display. William continued describing an ambitious strategy that would reshape Anderson Capital for the next decade. Then he paused and smiled toward Claire. The vision you are about to see belongs entirely to our Chief Executive Officer. Ethan looked up sharply. Although he already knew Claire led the company, hearing William publicly introduce her with that title somehow carried even greater impact. Claire stepped calmly onto the stage as the room welcomed her with respectful applause. She rested one hand gently against the podium before looking across the audience. For a brief moment her eyes met Ethan's. There was no anger in her expression. No bitterness. Only quiet confidence and calm professionalism. Then she turned toward the audience and began outlining a future she had been building long before Ethan ever realized the extraordinary woman standing beside him had never needed someone else's success to create her own. Claire's voice carried effortlessly across the room, calm enough that nobody needed to lean forward to hear her, yet confident enough that every conversation stopped the moment she began speaking. She did not overwhelm the audience with dramatic promises or exaggerated forecasts. Instead, she spoke about responsibility, long-term partnerships, and building companies that would still matter 20 years from now. Charts appeared behind her showing careful growth instead of explosive speculation. Case studies replaced marketing slogans. Every statistic was supported by measurable results. Ethan watched executives who normally challenged every proposal simply nod in quiet agreement. They were not being persuaded by polished presentation skills. They already trusted the person standing before them. When Claire finished outlining the expansion strategy, the room responded with sustained applause. William Anderson smiled proudly but remained in the background, allowing his daughter to receive the recognition herself. Questions followed immediately. One executive asked about artificial intelligence investments. Another requested clarification regarding healthcare acquisitions. Claire answered each one without referring to notes. She acknowledged uncertainty where it existed, explained risks honestly, and never exaggerated potential returns. Ethan recognized something painfully familiar. During their marriage, Claire had always approached problems the same way. She listened first, asked thoughtful questions, and only offered solutions after understanding every perspective. He had mistaken that patience for hesitation. In reality, it had always been disciplined leadership. As the presentation concluded, guests moved naturally into smaller discussion groups. Ethan remained where he was, uncertain whether approaching Claire would be appropriate. Before he could decide, Daniel Brooks quietly appeared once again. She asked if you would join her after the reception, he said. Ethan looked surprised. She did? Daniel nodded. There is a private lounge overlooking the river. 10 minutes. Ethan's heartbeat quickened. Did she say why? Daniel offered a polite smile. She prefers important conversations to happen face to face. Then he walked away before Ethan could ask anything further. Those 10 minutes felt longer than the previous 3 years combined. Ethan wandered toward the windows overlooking downtown Chicago, replaying countless memories with new understanding. Claire encouraging him to think beyond quarterly profits. Claire quietly celebrating the achievements of people around her instead of seeking attention herself. Claire declining expensive gifts while insisting meaningful relationships could never be purchased. Every memory seemed different now because the woman he remembered had never lacked opportunity. She had simply chosen humility. Vanessa joined him one final time. "I think I understand now," she said softly. Ethan looked toward her. "Understand what?" She smiled gently. "Why everyone here respects her. Wealth can impress people. Character keeps them." Ethan nodded without speaking. There was nothing he could add. Moments later Daniel returned. "She is ready." Ethan followed him through another quiet hallway leading toward a private lounge surrounded by floor-to-ceiling glass. The city shimmered beneath the evening lights while boats moved slowly along the Chicago River below. Claire stood alone near the windows holding a cup of herbal tea. When Daniel quietly closed the door behind them, silence settled comfortably across the room. For several seconds neither of them spoke. Finally Claire smiled with the same warmth Ethan remembered from years ago. "Hello, Ethan," he answered almost automatically. "Hello, Claire." The conversation began without anger, accusation, or uncomfortable tension. Two people simply acknowledging that time had changed them both. Ethan looked toward her before quietly saying, "I owe you an apology." Claire gently shook her head. "This evening is not about apologies." "Then why invite me?" Ethan asked. Claire rested one hand lightly against the curve of her pregnancy before looking out across the city. "Because there are things you deserve to know." Ethan felt his pulse quicken again. Claire continued speaking carefully. "When we divorced, I promised myself I would never let bitterness shape my decisions. That promise was more difficult than I expected, but it mattered." Ethan lowered his eyes. "You never told me who you really were." Claire smiled faintly. "You never asked?" The answer carried no blame. Only quiet truth. Ethan could not deny it. During their marriage he had rarely asked about her childhood, her family, or her ambitions outside supporting his career. He had assumed he already knew everything important. Claire continued. "I wanted someone to know Claire before they knew Anderson Capital. I wanted to build a marriage based on honesty instead of reputation." She paused briefly before adding, "For a long time, I believed we had that." Ethan closed his eyes for a moment. Every word landed gently, yet each one carried enormous weight. "I failed you," he admitted. Claire looked at him with calm understanding. "We both made choices. We cannot change them." Another quiet silence followed. Then Claire placed a slim blue folder on the table between them. "There is one more reason I asked you here." Ethan glanced at the folder without touching it. "What is it?" Claire met his eyes directly. "Something I should have shared 3 years ago, but the timing never felt right." Ethan slowly opened the folder. The first page contained a medical report dated only weeks after their divorce. His eyes moved downward until they stopped on a single sentence that made the room seem perfectly still. Estimated gestational age, 8 weeks. Ethan looked up in disbelief. Claire's voice remained steady, almost gentle. "The baby I am carrying is yours." For several long seconds Ethan could not speak. The sounds of the reception beyond the closed doors seemed to disappear completely, replaced by the quiet rhythm of his own breathing. He lowered his eyes to the medical report again, searching for some detail he had misunderstood. The examination date was real. The timeline matched perfectly. 8 weeks. The appointment had taken place shortly after the divorce became final. Ethan slowly looked back at Claire. "Why did you not tell me?" His voice was barely above a whisper. Claire did not answer immediately. Instead, she carefully closed the folder and rested both hands around the warm cup of tea in front of her. "I asked myself that question many Times, she said softly. Every answer led me back to the same place. Ethan remained silent. When I learned I was pregnant, Claire continued, our marriage had already ended emotionally, even if the paperwork had only recently been signed. You had made it clear that your future was moving in another direction. I did not want a child to become a reason for guilt, obligation, or resentment. Ethan shook his head. You should have given me the choice. Claire met his eyes calmly. Would it really have been a choice, Ethan? Or would you have felt trapped? The question settled between them without accusation. Ethan searched for an answer and found none. 3 years earlier he had been completely consumed by expansion plans, investor meetings, and public recognition. He remembered believing that nothing could interfere with the company he was determined to build. Looking back now, he could no longer pretend he knew how he would have responded. Claire gently continued. I wanted our child to grow up surrounded by people who chose to be present, not people who felt pressured to stay. Ethan slowly sat down across from her. So you raised this child alone? Claire smiled faintly. I have never truly been alone. She glanced toward the conference room where William Anderson continued greeting guests. My family stood beside me every step of the way. So did many of the people you met tonight. Ethan followed her gaze through the glass wall. He suddenly understood why everyone at Anderson Capital cared so deeply about her. They were more than colleagues. They had witnessed every stage of her journey. Claire looked back at him. There is something else you should know. Ethan nodded quietly. Go ahead. I never spoke negatively about you in front of our child. Ethan looked surprised. Claire continued with the same gentle honesty. Children deserve the freedom to form their own opinions. They should never inherit someone else's disappointment. Ethan felt an unexpected weight settle inside his chest. Does our child know who I am? Claire smiled. Not yet. Right now there is only excitement about becoming a mother and preparing for a new chapter. She paused. Briefly before adding, there will be questions one day. I always intended to answer them truthfully. Ethan looked down at his hands. I do not deserve the kindness you are showing me. Claire shook her head. This is not kindness. It is responsibility. Outside the lounge windows, the lights of downtown Chicago reflected across the river as boats drifted quietly beneath the bridges. The peaceful view contrasted sharply with the storm of emotions Ethan struggled to organize. He had arrived expecting another corporate reception. Instead, every certainty he once held had quietly dissolved. Was that why you asked me here? He finally asked. To tell me about the baby? Claire nodded once before reaching into the blue folder again. She removed another document and slid it gently across the table. Not entirely. Ethan unfolded the pages and immediately recognized his own company's logo at the top. Walker Technologies. Beneath it appeared several investment summaries, shareholder reports, and acquisition analyses dating back nearly 4 years. What is this? He asked. Claire folded her hands together. A history of every time Anderson Capital reviewed your company. Ethan looked through the documents in disbelief. Each report contained detailed evaluations, financial projections, and recommendations prepared by senior analysts. Several pages carried handwritten notes, signed by different committee members. Then he noticed something unusual. Beside every recommendation involving Walker Technologies appeared one identical sentence. Chief Executive Officer Claire Anderson has formally recused herself from all discussion and voting related to this matter. Ethan looked up. Claire quietly explained. I wanted every decision involving your company to remain completely fair. If Anderson Capital invested, it would be because the numbers justified it. If we declined, it would never be because of our past. Ethan slowly turned another page. Some reports recommended immediate investment. Others advised waiting for stronger financial performance. None had been influenced by Claire herself. You protected the process, Ethan said quietly. Claire nodded. Trust is difficult to build and very easy to lose. Ethan closed the folder carefully. I spent years believing you had disappeared from my life. Claire smiled with quiet warmth. No, Ethan. I simply stopped standing where you expected to find me. Before Ethan could respond, there was a gentle knock on the lounge door. Daniel Brooks stepped inside with his usual composed expression. I apologize for interrupting, he said. The final acquisition committee is ready. They cannot begin without you, Claire. Claire stood gracefully and adjusted the front of her ivory jacket. Daniel handed her another folder before quietly stepping back into the hallway. Claire turned once more toward Ethan. There is still one conversation we need to have, she said. But first, I have a responsibility to nearly 20,000 employees depending on the decision we are about to make. Ethan stood as well, watching her prepare to leave. For the first time in his life, he realized the woman he once believed existed only in the background had been carrying responsibilities far greater than his own all along, and despite everything that had happened between them, she had never allowed personal regret to interfere with doing what she believed was right. After Claire left the private lounge with Daniel Brooks, the room felt strangely quiet. Ethan remained standing beside the glass wall overlooking the Chicago River, the blue folder still resting in his hands. He no longer saw financial reports or shareholder analyses. He saw years of assumptions collapsing one after another. The woman he believed had quietly disappeared after their divorce had been shaping industries, protecting professional ethics, preparing to become a mother, and carrying responsibilities that reached far beyond anything he had imagined. A gentle knock interrupted his thoughts. Daniel stepped back inside. Mr. Walker, Miss Anderson asked if you would observe the final committee session. You will not participate, but she believes you should see how the decision is made. Ethan hesitated only briefly before following him through another secure hallway. They entered a large executive boardroom surrounded by floor-to-ceiling windows. A polished walnut table stretched across the center of the room. 20 seats were already occupied by senior executives, attorneys, financial analysts, and independent directors. Every document had been carefully organized. Every presentation screen displayed detailed financial models. At the far end of the table sat William Anderson, but noticeably not in the central chair. That seat remained empty. Moments later, Claire entered carrying a slim portfolio. Every conversation stopped immediately. Without ceremony, she greeted the room with a simple smile before taking the chair at the head of the table. Nobody announced her authority because nobody needed to. It was understood long before she arrived. Ethan quietly accepted a seat along the back wall reserved for observers. Good evening, Claire began. Thank you all for staying late. Before we review today's acquisition proposal, I would like to remind everyone of our guiding principle. We do not purchase companies simply because we can. We invest where people, innovation, and long-term responsibility align. The room responded with quiet agreement. The first presentation began. Charts appeared across several large screens showing projected growth, employee retention, research investments, and regional expansion opportunities. Analysts presented risks alongside potential rewards. Claire listened carefully without interrupting. Occasionally she asked brief questions that immediately revealed details others had overlooked. How would this decision affect employees 5 years from now? She asked one presenter. Have we considered regional supplier stability? She asked another. What assumptions support this revenue forecast during an economic slowdown? Every question shifted the discussion toward deeper analysis. Ethan noticed something remarkable. Claire never tried to prove she was the smartest person in the room. Instead, she encouraged everyone else to think more carefully. Nearly 2 hours passed before Daniel Brooks stood and introduced the final agenda item. Walker Technologies Strategic Partnership Review. Ethan instinctively straightened in his chair. A detailed presentation filled the screens. Revenue, growth, market position, product innovation, competitive strengths. Every aspect of his company had been thoroughly evaluated. Daniel concluded with a balanced recommendation. The committee believes Walker Technologies remains a strong long-term opportunity. However, several governance questions require final consideration before approval. Claire remained completely expressionless. "Thank you," she said. "Does anyone wish to add further analysis?" Several directors offered thoughtful comments regarding technology integration and international expansion. No one mentioned Ethan personally. No one referred to Claire's previous marriage. The discussion remained entirely professional. When the conversation ended, Claire quietly folded her hands. "As recorded consistently over the past several years," she said, "I will again remove myself from this decision because of my previous personal relationship with Mr. Walker." She looked toward the company's general counsel. "Please note my recusal in the official minutes." Ethan watched in disbelief as Claire calmly stood from the head of the table. She did not attempt to influence anyone. She did not remain in the room. She simply walked toward the exit before pausing briefly. "The committee has my full confidence," she said. "Whatever decision you reach will have my complete support." Then she quietly left the boardroom. Ethan stared toward the closed door long after she disappeared. William Anderson finally looked across the table toward the remaining directors. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "our Chief Executive Officer has once again demonstrated exactly why this institution has earned the trust of so many partners. Personal history must never outweigh professional integrity." A unanimous murmur of agreement spread across the room. The vote began immediately afterward. Independent directors reviewed the recommendation one final time before electronic ballots appeared on secure tablets. Within minutes the results were finalized. Daniel reviewed the outcome before smiling slightly. "The motion passes. Walker Technologies would move forward with the partnership." Ethan felt an unexpected mixture of relief and humility. The approval had not been granted because Claire wished to help him. In fact, she had deliberately removed herself from the process to guarantee fairness. The investment had been earned on merit alone. As directors slowly gathered their papers, William approached Ethan with an expression that carried both wisdom and kindness. "Business is built on numbers," he said quietly. "Reputation is built on choices. My daughter has spent years protecting both." Ethan lowered his eyes. "I understand that now." William smiled gently. "Understanding is valuable. What you choose to do with that understanding matters even more." Through the glass wall, Ethan noticed Claire standing alone on an outdoor terrace overlooking the river, the evening breeze moving gently through her hair as one hand rested naturally over the life she carried. For the first time since their marriage ended, he realized that the greatest distance between them had never been measured in years. It had been measured in everything he had failed to see while she quietly became exactly the leader she had always been. The cool evening air carried the distant sound of traffic as Ethan stepped onto the outdoor terrace overlooking the Chicago River. Claire did not turn immediately. She stood quietly beneath the city lights, watching reflections ripple across the water while dozens of illuminated buildings painted the skyline with silver and gold. For several moments neither of them spoke. The silence no longer felt uncomfortable. It felt honest. Ethan slowly approached until several feet separated them. "Congratulations," he said softly. "Not only for tonight, but for everything you have built." Claire smiled without looking away from the river. "Thank you." Ethan released a slow breath. "I used to believe success meant becoming the person everyone recognized when you entered a room." Claire finally turned toward him. "And now?" Ethan glanced back through the glass wall where executives continued talking inside the boardroom. "Now I think real success is becoming the person everyone trusts after you leave the room." Claire's smile grew slightly warmer. "That is a lesson many people spend an entire lifetime learning." Ethan nodded. "I was almost one of them." They stood together in comfortable silence again before Ethan spoke more quietly. "There is something I still cannot understand." Claire waited patiently. "If you already knew who you were, if you had all of this before we met, why did you choose such an ordinary life with me?" Claire looked toward the skyline again before answering. "Because I wanted something money could never buy." Ethan remained silent. "When I was growing up," she continued, "people treated me differently the moment they learned my last name. Some wanted opportunities. Some wanted introductions. Others wanted approval. It became difficult to know who actually saw me. She folded her hands gently. When I met you, you had no idea who my family was. You argued with me about baseball. You laughed at terrible movies with me. You talked about your dreams without trying to impress me. For the first time in a long while, I felt completely ordinary. Ethan lowered his eyes. I wish I had stayed that person. Claire answered gently. So do I. The words contained no bitterness. Only quiet sadness for something that had once been real. Ethan looked at her with sincere regret. Somewhere along the way I started measuring everything by growth charts, company valuations, and magazine covers. I convinced myself that if I kept climbing, everything else would somehow stay where I left it. Claire nodded slowly. Many people believe that. But you did not stay where I left you. Claire smiled faintly. No. Life keeps moving for everyone. Ethan looked toward the river before asking another difficult question. Did you ever stop loving me immediately after the divorce? Claire took her time before answering. Feelings rarely disappear because a judge signs paperwork. Ethan felt a quiet ache in his chest. Claire continued calmly. But love also requires trust, respect, and shared direction. When those disappear long enough, love changes into gratitude for what once existed. Eventually it becomes acceptance. Ethan understood exactly what she meant. She was not speaking about revenge. She was describing healing. I am sorry, he said again. Not because I lost everything tonight. I did not. My company is stronger than ever, thanks in part to a fair decision you protected. I am sorry because I lost sight of the person standing beside me long before I lost the marriage. Claire studied him for several quiet seconds before answering. Acknowledging that takes courage. Ethan gave a faint smile. It took me far too long. A gentle breeze moved across the terrace. Claire instinctively rested one hand over her pregnancy. Ethan noticed the simple gesture and asked carefully, How are you feeling? Very well, she replied with a soft smile. The doctor says everything is progressing exactly as it should. Ethan looked down for a moment before gathering enough courage to ask the question that mattered most. Do you believe there could ever be a place for me in our child's life? Claire did not answer immediately. Instead, she watched a sightseeing boat glide slowly beneath the bridge below. Finally, she turned back toward him. Being a father is not something that begins with biology alone. It begins with consistency, patience, honesty, and showing up when no one is keeping score. Ethan listened carefully. If that is what you truly want, Claire continued, then the opportunity should belong to our child as much as it belongs to you. Hope quietly appeared in Ethan's eyes for the first time that evening. Claire gently raised one hand before he could speak. But understand something clearly. I am not reopening our marriage. I am opening the possibility that two adults can build a respectful future for someone who deserves the best of both of us. Ethan nodded immediately. I understand. Do you? Claire asked softly. Because this cannot be motivated by regret alone. Regret fades. Responsibility remains. Ethan looked directly into her eyes. Then I will spend whatever time is necessary proving that I finally understand the difference. Claire searched his expression carefully. Before she could answer, Daniel Brooks quietly stepped onto the terrace. I apologize for interrupting, he said respectfully. The media briefing downstairs has concluded, and your driver is ready whenever you are, Claire. She thanked him with a nod before looking back at Ethan one final time. The next chapter will not be decided by promises, she said gently. It will be decided by choices. Then she turned toward the elevator, leaving Ethan standing beneath the Chicago skyline with the clearest understanding he had ever possessed that the future he hoped to earn would depend not on what he said next, but on everything he chose to become from that moment forward. The following Monday arrived with an unfamiliar sense of purpose. For the first time in years, Ethan Walker entered his office without thinking first about quarterly earnings, investor expectations, or stock valuations. Instead, his thoughts returned to a quiet sentence spoken beneath the Chicago skyline. Regret fades. Responsibility remains. Those 4 words had followed him through the weekend more persistently than any business proposal ever had. As he walked through the headquarters of Walker Technologies, something else caught his attention. Employees greeted one another with genuine warmth. Junior engineers discussed new ideas over coffee. Receptionists welcomed visitors by name. It was the same building he had entered hundreds of times before, yet somehow he had rarely slowed down long enough to notice the people inside it. Mark Reynolds joined him in the executive conference room carrying the latest financial reports. "Congratulations," he said with a broad smile. "The Anderson Capital Partnership was officially finalized this morning. Investors are already responding positively." Ethan accepted the folder but did not open it immediately. "That is good news," he replied. Mark looked puzzled. "Only good?" Ethan smiled faintly. "A week ago I would have called it the biggest achievement of the year. Today it feels like the beginning of a much longer journey." Throughout the morning, Ethan surprised nearly everyone around him. Instead of rushing through meetings, he asked department managers about employee development. Instead of focusing only on expansion targets, he requested reports on staff retention, mentoring programs, and family leave policies. Olivia Carter noticed the difference almost immediately. "You are asking different questions today," she observed after one meeting ended. Ethan looked toward the busy office outside the conference room windows. "I spent years measuring success by what we built. I should have been paying more attention to the people building it." Olivia smiled knowingly. "Someone must have reminded you of that." Ethan quietly nodded. That afternoon, another unexpected visitor arrived. William Anderson stepped into Ethan's office without an entourage, carrying nothing except a small leather notebook. The older man accepted a cup of coffee before sitting comfortably across the desk. "I hope you do not mind an unannounced visit," William said warmly. Ethan shook his head. "It is an honor." William looked around the office before smiling. "Claire mentioned this few years ago. She said watching the river helped you think." Ethan felt another quiet reminder of how much Claire had noticed during their marriage. William reached into his notebook and removed a single folded photograph. He placed it gently on the desk. Ethan unfolded it carefully. The picture showed Claire several months earlier standing inside a nursery painted soft shades of cream and pale blue. She was smiling while assembling a small wooden bookshelf with the help of William. Books filled one wall. A rocking chair rested beside a sunlit window. Everything about the room reflected warmth rather than luxury. "She built the nursery herself," William said proudly. "She insisted every shelf should be low enough for a curious child to reach without asking permission." Ethan studied the photograph quietly. "She always loved books." William nodded. "She also believes children should grow up believing kindness is more valuable than status." Another silence settled comfortably between them before William spoke again. "Claire did not ask me to come." Ethan looked up. "Then why are you here?" William answered with complete honesty. "Because every child deserves adults capable of choosing wisdom over pride." Ethan listened carefully. William continued. "You cannot change yesterday. Neither can Claire. But the future does not belong to yesterday unless you allow it to." Ethan folded the photograph carefully. "I want to earn the opportunity to be part of my child's life." William smiled gently. "Then begin by becoming the kind of father your child will one day be proud to know, regardless of whether anyone is watching." Before leaving, William paused near the office door. "One more thing," he added. "Claire has never spoken about you with anger. Please do not make her regret that kindness." After William departed, Ethan remained seated for a long time. That evening, instead of attending another networking dinner, he drove to a neighborhood bookstore he and Claire had once visited together. The small shop looked almost unchanged despite the passing years. An elderly owner recognized him immediately. "It has been a long time," she said warmly. Ethan smiled politely. "Yes, it has." The owner glanced toward an old display shelf. "Claire still visits every few weeks. She always buys books for children and leaves extra copies for families who cannot afford them." Ethan looked toward the shelf in quiet disbelief. There was no publicity. No charity announcement. No cameras. Simply another act of generosity that nobody had asked her to perform. He purchased several children's books before leaving, though he knew it would be many months before a little voice could enjoy hearing them read aloud. As he stepped back into the cool evening air carrying the small paper bag, Ethan realized something important. For years he had believed becoming extraordinary meant standing above everyone else. Claire had quietly spent those same years lifting other people instead. That difference explained why wealth had made him successful, but character had made her unforgettable. Nearly 4 months passed with surprising quietness. There were no dramatic confrontations, no public apologies, and no attempts to force the past into becoming something it could never be again. Instead, Ethan chose the slower path Claire had described. He showed up consistently. Every Friday afternoon he delivered a small package to the reception desk at Anderson Capital. Sometimes it contained a children's book with a handwritten note about why he hoped their child would enjoy the story one day. Sometimes it was a wooden puzzle, a tiny stuffed bear, or a simple music box crafted by a local artisan. None of the gifts were extravagant. None carried expensive jewelry or luxury labels. Claire accepted them politely through her assistant without making promises or encouraging expectations. She simply thanked him each time. Weeks later another package arrived at Ethan's office. Inside was a single photograph. Claire stood inside the nursery smiling beside the newest bookshelf. One of the children's books Ethan had delivered now rested on the lowest shelf, exactly where a small child would eventually be able to reach it. There was no letter. No explanation. Only the photograph. Somehow it meant more than pages of conversation ever could. Ethan quietly placed the picture inside the frame on his desk where business awards had once stood. His employees noticed the change. Olivia smiled the first time she saw it. "You replaced your Entrepreneur of the Year trophy." Ethan looked toward the photograph. "I found something more important to remind me what I am working for." Walker Technologies slowly changed as well. Family support programs expanded. Paid parental leave increased. Mentorship initiatives paired experienced leaders with younger employees. Ethan no longer measured success only by revenue growth. Company surveys 6 months later showed the highest employee satisfaction in the organization's history. During one leadership meeting, Mark Reynolds laughed softly before saying, "You know, people have started calling this place the company that actually remembers everyone has a family." Ethan smiled because he recognized exactly where that lesson had come from. One crisp autumn afternoon his phone rang while he was reviewing engineering proposals. Claire's name appeared on the screen for the first time since their conversation overlooking the river. Ethan answered immediately. "Hello?" Claire's calm voice carried the same quiet confidence he remembered. "Would you have time to meet this afternoon?" "Of course. There is a small park near Lake Michigan. 3 o'clock. I will be there." She thanked him before ending the call. The park overlooked the shoreline. Where leaves painted the walking paths with shades of gold and crimson. Families pushed strollers beneath towering oak trees while children laughed from a nearby playground. Claire sat on a wooden bench wrapped in a light wool coat, one hand resting naturally over the final weeks of her pregnancy. Ethan approached slowly. "Thank you for inviting me." Claire smiled. "Thank you for coming." They walked together along the lakeside trail at an easy pace. Neither felt the need to fill every moment with conversation. Eventually Claire stopped beside the water and handed Ethan a sealed envelope. "Open it." Inside he found copies of hospital registration documents. His eyes moved carefully across the page until one line caught his attention. "Emergency contact. Ethan Walker." He looked up in complete surprise. Claire nodded gently. "I thought about what I told you that night. Responsibility remains." Ethan struggled to find words. Claire continued softly. "Over the past few months you have never pressured me. You never asked for forgiveness. You never tried to rewrite history. You simply kept showing up." Ethan swallowed quietly. "Because I meant every word." "I know." She smiled with genuine warmth. Trust is not rebuilt through speeches. It is rebuilt through ordinary days. Ethan carefully folded the documents before asking, "Does this mean?" Claire answered before he finished. "It means I believe our child deserves to know both parents if both parents are willing to place that child's well-being ahead of their own pride." Emotion filled Ethan's eyes, but he remained silent. Claire gently continued, "I also want to be completely honest with you. We are not starting over. We are not trying to recreate the marriage we lost." Ethan nodded. "I understand. Do you?" she asked kindly. "Because sometimes people confuse gratitude with romance." Ethan looked toward the calm water stretching toward the horizon. "I love the woman I married," he said quietly. "I admire the woman you became. But I also know they are the same person. The one who changed the most was me." Claire's eyes softened. "That may be the truest thing you have ever said." A gentle breeze carried the scent of autumn across the lake. In the distance, church bells marked the beginning of another hour. Claire looked toward the families walking nearby before speaking once more. "Our child deserves peaceful birthdays, respectful conversations, and parents who celebrate important moments together without resentment." Ethan answered immediately. "Then that is exactly what I will work toward." Claire extended her hand. "Not as husband and wife." Ethan accepted her hand carefully. "As partners in raising someone extraordinary." They shook hands with quiet understanding. There were no photographers waiting nearby. No dramatic audience applauding the moment. Only two adults choosing maturity over bitterness beneath a sky slowly turning orange as the sun settled beyond Lake Michigan, and for the first time since everything had fallen apart years earlier, the future no longer felt like something either of them had to face alone. The first snowfall of December settled quietly across Chicago, covering rooftops, sidewalks, and tree branches with a blanket of fresh white that softened even the busiest streets. Inside St. Matthew Medical Center, however, no one paid much attention to the weather outside. Every heartbeat, every quiet footstep, and every hopeful smile belonged to a far more important moment. Ethan sat in the waiting area holding the same worn children's book he had purchased months earlier from the neighborhood bookstore Claire loved. The corners of its cover had become slightly bent from being carried so often. He had planned to read it one day, even if that day arrived much later than he originally imagined. William Anderson quietly took the seat beside him. Neither man felt the need to speak immediately. They simply waited together, sharing the kind of silence that only existed when something precious was about to change forever. A nurse finally stepped into the waiting room wearing a warm smile. "Mr. Walker?" Ethan stood immediately. "You may come in now." His heart raced as he followed her through the softly lit hallway. When he entered the private recovery room, the world seemed to pause. Claire rested comfortably against the raised hospital bed, looking tired but peaceful. In her arms lay a tiny baby wrapped in a pale blue blanket, sleeping with complete trust in a world that had only just welcomed a new life. Claire looked up and smiled. "Come meet your son." Ethan walked forward slowly, almost afraid that moving too quickly might somehow disturb the perfect stillness filling the room. He looked down at the sleeping child whose tiny hand rested outside the blanket. Without thinking, he offered one finger. The baby's hand instinctively closed around it. Such a small movement. Such an enormous moment. Ethan felt tears fill his eyes before he could stop them. Claire watched quietly, allowing the silence to say everything words could not. "His name is Benjamin," she said softly. Ethan smiled through grateful emotion. "It is perfect." Claire gently placed Benjamin into Ethan's waiting arms. For the first time, Ethan held his son close. Every business award, every magazine cover, every successful negotiation he had ever celebrated suddenly seemed impossibly small compared to the quiet weight of the little boy sleeping peacefully against his chest. "Hello, Benjamin," Ethan whispered. "I have been waiting a long time to meet you." William quietly stepped into the room with a gentle smile before stopping several feet away, allowing the new family their moment together. He looked toward Claire with unmistakable pride, then toward Ethan with quiet approval. Nothing else needed to be said. Several weeks later, Life settled into a comfortable rhythm neither Ethan nor Claire could have predicted years earlier. Every Wednesday evening Ethan visited Claire's home to spend time with Benjamin. Sometimes he read children's books while Benjamin slept peacefully beside them. Other evenings they simply talked about doctor appointments, future plans, and the countless small decisions new parents make together. There were no arguments over the past because both of them understood something important. Their child deserved parents who looked forward instead of backward. Walker Technologies continued growing steadily, but Ethan measured success differently now. Family photographs replaced achievement plaques inside his office. Employees often found him asking about school concerts, newborn babies, or aging parents before discussing quarterly reports. The culture of the company changed because its leader had changed first. Anderson Capital entered another remarkable year of responsible growth under Claire's leadership. Financial magazines continued speculating about the mysterious executive behind the company's extraordinary success. Claire still declined interviews whenever possible. Recognition had never been the goal. Building something meaningful remained enough. One spring afternoon, nearly a year after everything began, Ethan and Claire found themselves once again at the Grand Lexington. This time there were no unexpected discoveries waiting inside the elegant restaurant. No hidden identities remained. No unanswered questions lingered between them. Benjamin rested peacefully inside his stroller while Claire laughed at something Ethan had just said. The same waiter who had served Claire sparkling water on that unforgettable evening approached their table with a broad smile. "Welcome back," he said warmly. "It is wonderful to see all three of you." Ethan looked around the restaurant, and quietly remembered the night he first saw executives calling Claire boss. Back then he believed the greatest surprise of his life was discovering that his former wife secretly led one of the country's most influential investment firms. He smiled gently as Benjamin reached toward Claire with tiny hands. No. That had never been the greatest surprise. The greatest surprise was learning that real greatness had been standing beside him for years, asking for nothing except honesty, respect, and partnership. He simply had not been wise enough to recognize it until much later. Claire noticed him smiling. "What are you thinking about?" Ethan looked from her to Benjamin before answering honestly. "I used to believe life rewarded the loudest victories." Claire waited quietly. Ethan gently adjusted Benjamin's blanket before finishing his thought. "Now I know the greatest victories usually arrive so quietly that only grateful hearts notice them." Claire smiled, and for a brief moment neither of them spoke. Beyond the restaurant windows, the Chicago River continued flowing toward tomorrow, never turning back, never holding on to yesterday. Life had done the same. Some people spend years chasing wealth only to discover that character is worth infinitely more. Some spend years searching for power only to learn that trust cannot be purchased. And sometimes the greatest justice is not watching someone lose everything they own. Sometimes the greatest justice is watching someone finally become the person they should have been all along, because the most valuable second chance in life is never another opportunity to rewrite the past. It is the courage to honor the future,